Athletes arriving from diverse nations like her coming from Philippines, which is now a huge deal. She has been the greatest ever, tennis player from that country, which is vast country, and there's vast interest. So, the things like that happen. I mean, you could argue that it was maybe a poor schedule and maybe they could schedule them on a larger court. Yes, but again, she is so young and she's just coming through, so, and obviously the first couple rounds, the schedule is so dense. The main courts with big names, it's tough. Nobody expected Novak Djokovic to say what he said. That's what makes this whole thing so unique, so worth paying attention to. Because when a man with 24 Grand Slam titles goes out of his way to defend a 20-year-old, not just praise her, but actually defend her, something is happening beneath the surface that most people are missing entirely. And once you start pulling on that thread, you realize this isn't just a feel-good story about a rising star getting her flowers early. This is something that cuts much deeper into what tennis is becoming and where it's headed next. Eala walked into the Australian Open ranked 44th in the world. On paper, that's a respectable number, but not exactly a headline. Her season coming in was a mixed bag, 15 wins, 10 losses, a quarter-final run in Dubai that ended against Goff, a solid win over that same Goff just weeks later in Indian Wells when Goff was sitting at number 4 in the world. There were highs, real ones, but there were also some puzzling lows. A first-round loss at the Australian Open to a player ranked 99th, struggles on clay, tough draws that left her record on that surface looking rough. So, when she entered the French Open as a qualifier, she wasn't supposed to be the story. She, was supposed to be just another name working her way through the draw, trying to find some form, trying to rediscover the version of herself that had beaten top 10 players. But sport doesn't care about what's supposed to happen, and neither do crowds. Because what unfolded around her matches in that tournament wasn't something anyone had planned for or honestly even thought to plan for. Lines stretching so far back, they disappeared around corners. Fans standing in spots that weren't built for watching tennis, craning their necks. Standing on tiptoes, just trying to catch a glimpse. Thousands of people treating a qualifying round like it was a Grand Slam final on center court. Tournament staff were caught completely off guard. The scheduling hadn't accounted for any of this. How could it? A player ranked in the mid-40s doesn't typically require crowd management at that level. The system, precise and polished as it usually is, simply wasn't built for what Eala brings with her every single time she walks onto a court. And here is where Djokovic enters the picture in a way that nobody saw coming. Because when the conversation about that chaos started circulating, when the criticism about poor planning and overcrowding began to bubble up, Djokovic didn't just stay quiet. He stepped in. He reframed the entire thing. He looked at what everyone was calling a logistical failure and said, Actually, look at what this really means. A country of over 100 million people has a tennis player to believe in. The system wasn't ready. Of course, it wasn't. How do you prepare for something you've never seen before? That's not a scheduling problem. That's a signal. And when Djokovic calls something a signal, people in the tennis world listen. Because this is not a man who throws words around carelessly. This is someone who has shared a generation with Federer and Nadal, who has been in rooms and on courts, where greatness gets measured in the most unforgiving ways possible. When he says he sees something in a young player, that observation comes loaded with context and experience that most people simply don't have access to. But what makes this whole situation even more layered is that Djokovic isn't alone in feeling this way. That's the part that really starts to shift things when you look closely enough. Players across the tour have been gravitating toward Eala with a kind of energy that doesn't feel like casual politeness. You know how veterans usually respond to younger players, a kind word here, a brief acknowledgement there, the standard passing of the torch. This is different. The tone is warmer. The words are more specific. There's something almost protective about it. Like the locker room has collectively decided that this person and what she represents deserves to be treated carefully and seriously. One player talked about watching her at the US Open and then going home, thinking about and coming back because she felt she needed to witness whatever was going to happen next. She described Eala as someone whose voice and platform would eventually transcend the sport itself, connecting tennis to fashion, to art, to culture. To a generation that doesn't just consume sports, but lives inside them. That's not a throwaway comment. That's someone looking at a bigger picture and recognizing that Eala is already operating inside it, whether the rankings reflect that yet or not. Another opponent who had just pushed through a tough match against her couldn't stop herself from being generous in the aftermath. Music. She talked about Eala's aggression, the way she goes for her shots without hesitation, the lefty angle that creates problems you can't fully prepare for even when you know it's coming. And then she said something that stuck, that Eala doesn't need anyone to tell her she's a great player because the evidence is already there, and it's only going to get louder. That kind of respect from someone who just went through the battle of trying to beat her carries a completely different weight than a press conference compliment. And the fans feel all of this. That's what you have to understand about the crowds that show up for her matches. These aren't casual observers who wandered over because there was nothing else on. These are people who traveled, who waited, music, who gave up comfort and convenience just to be in the same space as her while she plays. Filipino communities from Vienna, from Linz, from Salzburg, all converging on one court because one of their own is out there competing at the highest level of the sport. Music. You could see it in the interviews, the fans talking about what it means to finally have someone to watch, someone who looks like them, carries their culture with her, and plays on the biggest stages without shrinking. That kind of emotional investment doesn't build overnight. It builds through years of absence and longing, and then suddenly, there she is. Music. And when Djokovic acknowledges that this is what's happening around her, he's not just being kind. He's telling the sport something important. Tennis has always sold itself as a global game, but the reality for a long time was that certain countries, certain cultures, certain parts of the world felt more like spectators of the sport than participants in it. What Eala represents is a crack in that old framework, and the flood coming through that crack is something none of the existing structures were built to handle. Here's what's fascinating about where Eala actually is right now in her development. Because, music, her story isn't one of smooth linear progress. It's messier than that, which honestly makes it more compelling. She's had moments of brilliance that stop people mid-conversation. She's also had results that raised questions about consistency, about clay, about whether the mental weight of all this attention might be too much too soon. She talked once about a conversation with her coach after Miami. After her run there opened up a whole new world of attention and opportunity. And her coach asked her what the lesson was in all of it. She thought about it and landed somewhere unexpected. She said, music. The lesson was that when you're doing badly, it's not as bad as music, you think. And when you sit with that for a moment, that's a remarkably grounded thing for a 20-year-old to absorb in the middle of sudden fame. Music. It suggests that whatever pressure is swirling around her on the outside, there's something stable at the center of her music approach. The routines stay the same. The tight circle around her stays the same. The work doesn't change just because the world is suddenly paying attention. That kind of psychological foundation is rare, and it matters enormously at this level. What Djokovic understands, perhaps better than anyone still active in the sport, is that raw talent alone never created a shift like this. You need all the other things too. Music, the personality, the presence, the story, the connection to something larger than just tennis. And Eala has all of those things happening simultaneously in a way that feels almost impossible to engineer. You can't manufacture a fan base that passionate. You can't fake the reaction of thousands of people who have been waiting their whole lives to see someone like her succeed. And you certainly can't replicate the specific kind of electricity that fills a court when the crowd isn't just hoping she wins, but genuinely needs her too. Music. Analysts watching her draw at various tournaments have noted that the matchups around her are starting to become compelling storylines in their own right. If she gets through this round, who does she face next? What happens when she plays someone she's already beaten recently? What happens when she faces someone who's studied the lefty angles and has answers? These are the questions that surround players who matter. Players who shift the way a tournament feels even before the match starts. Djokovic made a point once that cuts right to the heart of all this. He said he loves that tennis has evolved to the point where countries that were never historically part of the sport music suddenly produce a talent so undeniable that it forces everyone to recalibrate. Music. He mentioned the Rafa Nadal Academy connection, the lefty comparison, careful not to make it reductive, but clearly feeling it was worth saying out loud. He called her a great story. But the way he said it, you got the sense he wasn't just talking about narrative. He was talking about necessity. Tennis needs great stories. It needs players who pull people in who weren't already there, who make the whole ecosystem larger and louder and more unpredictable. And the tennis world is slowly waking up to the fact that the infrastructure around the sport, the scheduling, the court assignments, the crowd management, the media attention, all of it is going to have to evolve to match what she generates. Djokovic's broader point about the chaos surrounding her matches being a feature rather than a flaw is going to be a theme that keeps coming back. Because the Australian Open, the French Open, every tournament that hosts are going forward is going to have to make decisions they've never had to make before. How many courts do you run simultaneously? How early do you open gates? Music. How do you handle a crowd that didn't come to watch the tournament, but came specifically for her? These aren't hypotheticals anymore. They've already happened, and the sport's response to those moments will say a lot about whether tennis is genuinely ready to grow in the direction it claims it wants to grow. What keeps this story from being simple is that Eala herself doesn't seem interested in being a symbol. She's interested in winning. She wants the results to speak. Music. She wants to climb. She wants to be the kind of player that is feared for her game and not music, just beloved for her background. That tension between what she represents culturally and what she's trying to build competitively is where the most interesting version of her story lives. And it's where Djokovic's respect lands with the most weight, because he's not just praising her potential in some vague diplomatic way. He's pointing at something real that's already happening and telling anyone willing to pay attention that they should probably not look away. Because transformations in sport don't announce themselves neatly. They arrive through cracks in expected order, through crowds that don't fit. Music, through legends pausing to say something they didn't have to say, through a 20-year-old from the Philippines standing on a red clay court in Europe with thousands of people behind her and the quiet, steady belief that the game she's been building her whole life is finally big enough for the moment she's standing in. That's not potential anymore. That's the beginning of something that nobody is fully ready for. And if Djokovic's read on this is right, the sport itself is about to find that out. Find that out.